Recording here. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next series of interviews with subject matter experts throughout the country. My name is Cindy McDonald. I'm an instructor with the UCLA program. I teach both the special issues and the college admissions practice sessions. And with me today, I have Todd Johnson. And I've known Todd for many years. He's a college admissions counselor with a special focus working with students in STEM and especially in medical schools. So welcome, Todd. We're glad you're here today.
Thanks, Cindy.
So my students have lots of questions, as I do too. So the first thing we want to know is learn a little bit more about yourself. How long have you been working with students?
I've had the business almost 10 years, but for 7 years before that, I volunteered at a local high school working with students. So altogether, it's been about 17 years.
And how did you get involved in doing the special emphasis on medical school and STEM students?
Pure happenstance. Basically, one of the first students I had when I started the business was interested in BSMD programs. And these are programs where students are applying to college and medical school right from high school. So they get a guaranteed admission to med school if they're accepted. And so I was familiar with the programs and had information about them from my own investigation. So I worked with a student. Student got a good result and started telling her friends about it. So I started getting more phone calls, and I thought, well, I have a pretty active website, so I did kind of a throwaway blog on BSMD programs, got a huge number of hits. So I figured, well, okay, I did another posting, and then another one, and another one. So finally, I had enough postings that I realized I could put a book together here. So I wrote a book in 2011 on BSMD programs. And basically, it's kind of gone from there. And so very quickly, it developed from an individual student to pretty much taking over our whole practice. So now, about 80% of our students are applying to the BSMD programs, applying to regular colleges as well as backup options, and then 20% of our students are applying to med school through the traditional route.
So you do both the graduate and the undergraduate then?
Yeah.
So many of our students may not know exactly what a BSMD program is. So can you explain what that really means and what that looks like from a student perspective?
Yeah, there are about 120 of them throughout the country. And basically, high school students, their senior year, apply to a college, but also are applying to an associated medical school. And if they get accepted into the program, they're accepted not only into the college, but they have a seat guaranteed for them at the medical school when they get to that point. Most of the programs, about half are 8-year programs, the other half are mostly 7-year programs, where there's a reduction in a year that's at the undergraduate level, so they have 3 years of undergraduate education and 4 years of med school. There are a couple of 6-year programs still around where you have 2 years of undergraduate college and then your 4 years of med school. So for the student that is really, really convinced early on that medicine is a good option for them, it's a very nice way to do things because you don't have to go through the whole med school acceptance process because you've already done it when you applied to college. These are, however, incredibly competitive programs. These are generally the most competitive programs in the country, ranging in acceptance rates from 1% to the so-called easy programs run about 7 to 8% acceptance rates. So, even the easy programs that people talk about, I tell them, it's about the same as Yale and Princeton as far as acceptance rate. So a lot of very qualified students do not get in. But, if you can get in, it's a great option for some students.
So for those students, and I've worked with some over the years myself here in California, how does that admissions process differ for them who, when they're looking at going in as a BSMD, how has that changed? And how do you set up that, balance so that they do have a choice at the end of the process?
Well, again, because it's so competitive, I always make sure that our students are applying to regular colleges as well. Mm-hmm. Focus on the regular colleges and those that have a strong history of getting kids to med school through the traditional route. So if they get into a BSMD program, great. If they don't, hopefully they're getting into some college that has got a likely chance of getting them to med school through the traditional route. But as far as the general admissions, it's actually very similar to start with, in that you apply to the college that has the associated program. So you would apply to Northwestern, as an example, that has a program. And what happens then is, with a lot of the programs, they'll take a look at the student, decide if they're going to admit the student. If they do, evaluate whether that student would be a competitive candidate for the medical school. If so, pass that information on to the medical school, and then the medical school decides whether they're going to ask additional questions and do an interview of the student. So it's really those additional questions that get involved and the interview that it really deviates quite a bit from the traditional process, because now we're much more into the standard med school admission process.
So does this mean that they're doing this much earlier? How does that affect their timeline when they're trying to do both traditional and this?
Yeah, the BSMD applications are pretty much all due between November 1 and November 30th. So I always have my students start as early as possible. We start working on essays as soon as they finish junior year. Work on essays throughout the summer and into the fall. Because again, you've got, for most of the students, the Common App personal statement, but the additional essays for the BSMD programs, why doctor, why this program, why this, there tend to be a lot of additional essays. So my typical students writing 20 to 25 different essays. So a lot of focus on the essays and getting it done early so that they can reach those deadlines in November. And then once they've done with those, then they can look at doing the deadlines for the regular colleges, which are typically end of the year.
And so how many colleges do they typically apply when you're going through that process?
It really varies. I would say on average, probably 5 to 7 BSMD programs and 10 to 12 traditional programs. But I regularly have students applying to 20 or more BSMD programs in regular colleges. So, I mean, I recommend it, but some students, because they understand how competitive it is, really want to throw a broad, net out there to kind of see what will happen. So.
Well, and the type of schools, I remember in one particular student that I worked with recently, the kind of schools that she wanted to do the BSMD programs were different than if she went the traditional route. And we ended up with 22 different schools. Yeah. And like there was one in Pennsylvania. Well, she didn't get into the BSMD. She wasn't going to go to Pennsylvania from California. And she ended up at UCLA in a traditional program just because it's so competitive. So what do the colleges look for students, especially, the key thing is you're coming out of high school, as you said, and you want to go medical school. How do they demonstrate that? What are the colleges looking for that say, yes, you know what you want to do? Because at 16, 17, yeah. How do you know that's what you want to do?
The first issue that the colleges look at is your grades, the classes you took to get those grades, and your test scores. Mm-hmm. Because these are so competitive, you generally need minimum grades, minimum test scores to even be considered. But I always tell my students, grades and test scores alone get you considered. They don't get you admitted. For admissions, they're looking at a variety of other things. They're looking at how much volunteering the student has, particularly healthcare-related volunteering. And the focus is on volunteering that's got patient care. A lot of students think that means they got to be in the hospital, doing no. It can be at a nursing home. It can be lots of different things to get that patient contact. And students also want to know, how many hours do I need? Mm-hmm. And I always tell them, I don't know, because it really doesn't matter. What matters is regular, consistent volunteering. The more consistent volunteering you've got, if you do it every week for a couple of years, you're going to look like a much more serious candidate. And somebody who's been thinking about helping people much more than the student who comes in the summer before senior year and says, I got to put in 400 hours. That looks like a student who just thought of medicine. Research, particularly scientific research, is always a nice thing to have. Mm-hmm. Most students have at least a summer's worth. Some students have 3-4 years of regular research. And again, you don't necessarily need all of these things, but depending on the programs you're looking at and depending on what your background is, having something that really stands out can be very beneficial. They're looking for students that have done some doctor shadowing, following doctors around basically. And the purpose of that is to make sure the student really understands what the life of a physician is like. Mm-hmm. You know, when the TV show House was popular, I'd always have students say, well, I want to be like House. Great, but that's not real life. You know, that's a TV show. And that's what the med schools really want students to understand is what's real world medicine like. And, you know, it can be a great field, but there's also a lot of downsides. I mean, it's a huge time commitment. You can miss appointments because you get emergencies come up. You got to understand all of that going into it. Leadership is always helpful, of course. And maturity is a huge issue with the BSMD programs. And there's various ways to show this, but oftentimes it comes through even in the essays of what you write about, how you write about things. In the Why Doctor essay, how do you explain why you want to be a physician? All of those things can reflect on levels of maturity. As well as, again, going back to the volunteering, regular, consistent volunteering takes a pretty high level of maturity for most students, because most kids, if they volunteer, they do 2 hours here, and they do 2 hours there, and then something over here for this project. And it's kind of all over the board, which is okay, but it's not really what the BSMD programs are looking for. So maturity is a huge issue.
So you talk about the essays and what the students need to write about and the number of essays they have to do. How do you help them get beyond the, I want to be a doctor so I can help people?
Well, we need to break it down into kind of the elements of what does that mean. So typically I will have them start off by talking about what first got their interest in medicine. Then talk about your volunteering and kind of the human side of medicine. Then we'll talk about research and scientific method and understanding that and the science side of medicine. And then talking about physician shadowing and the human side of medicine. And based on all of those experiences, you've realized that healthcare is the best option for you. So it's kind of again, dealing with this maturity issue, but kind of in an essay demonstrating the growth process that has occurred with the student.
I think that's very sage advice, and helps students to dig a little deeper and understand a little bit more. So in terms of, let's broaden this just a little bit, in terms of working with students who are interested in, you know, STEM subjects, how do we as counselors evaluate, or how do we advise our students to look at a BSMD or just, you know, a pre-med program in terms of the quality? What questions should students and counselors be asking when they talk to colleges about this?
Well, I think the much bigger issue is just the traditional pre-med, because that's what most students are doing and what most students, frankly, are qualified for. Mm-hmm. It's really tricky, because if you ask a school, what's your pre-med placement rate? Most schools are going to tell you it's fabulous, you know, 80, 90, 100%. I hear this all the time. But the problem with that general question is what's happening is the colleges have figured out that this can be important for students and parents. Mm-hmm. So they jimmy the numbers. And what they do is they will only recommend for the medical school those that have got very high MCAT scores, medical college admission test, and very high grades. So that the kid with a 3.5 and maybe a 80 percentile MCAT score might be a decent candidate for med school, but they won't write him a recommendation because they think he might not get in. So when you're only writing recommendations, and recommendations are pretty much required for med school. So if you only write recommendations for those with the best scores, the best grades, yes, you're going to have high placement rates.
Right.
I mean, it's just natural, because, again, med schools look beyond grades and test scores, but that's certainly a big portion of it, much more so even than at the undergraduate level. So what you really want to ask is getting into, who do you write recommendations for? Do you pick and choose, or do you write recommendations for everybody? Mm-hmm. When the schools write recommendations for everybody, that means that kid with a 2.9 and a, 30 percentile MCAT score is going to get a recommendation letter. Is he going to get in? Not very likely, which means it's going to drag the college's numbers down. So oftentimes, the colleges that are the most honest, might have 60, 65% placement rate, which actually is a pretty good placement rate. But when everybody else is telling you they're at 90%, it doesn't look so good.
Right.
So you need to make sure you're comparing apples to apples here. And this is true not just with the ordinary schools out there. The Ivies, the highly selective colleges, a lot of them play the same game.
They're not all altruistic, Todd?
No, unfortunately.
So what about with, what else should our counselors or my class know about working with students who are interested in pursuing STEM majors?
I will tell you, this applies to med school, but it also applies generally to STEM. If you look at the colleges that are generating PhDs in the sciences, almost all of them are small liberal arts colleges. And most people are amazed at that because they assume that to do STEM, you need to go to a major university where you're going to get all sorts of high-level research, and et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is the students at the small liberal arts colleges or the smaller universities, so a Caltech, which is 900 kids undergrad, extremely small, but most of their kids are going on to PhD programs. And part of that relates to, well, some schools are just kind of geared toward PhD programs or doctoral degrees. Others are more geared toward business or whatever. But a lot of the small liberal arts colleges, because you have small class sizes, the students get to know the basic sciences well. And that translates into whether you're taking your GRE or whether you're taking your MCAT. That the students at these smaller schools often will have much higher scores. And the research often is much better at the smaller schools because it may not be as cutting edge as Berkeley might have or Michigan might have. But the reality is the ordinary undergrad is not going to get that cutting edge research anyway. That's going to grad students. And at the big universities, grad students are what it's all about. And undergrads are just kind of, they're here. And if we can get them some research, great. But that's not the focus. At the small liberal arts colleges, there's no grad students to deal with. It's all going to the undergrad. So oftentimes we'll see better research focus actually at the undergraduate level with the smaller schools. The third thing is getting to know professors is typically easier at small schools. I don't want to pick on Berkeley, but honestly, I've seen such terrible results out of Berkeley with students applying to pre-med or applying to med school because they're not getting the recommendations. Because they don't know the professors.
Right.
The advising, frankly, is not very good. Advising generally tends to be better at some of the smaller schools. But again, this is not a universal. Not all small schools are good. Not all bigger schools are as bad. But in general terms, the smaller the school, the better they're going to do at STEM, whether it's med school or PhD programs. And honestly, in this day and age, a BA or a BS in chemistry and biology, what do you do with that?
Right.
I mean, there are some jobs, but for the most part, you're looking at graduate level degrees if you're in the STEM fields anyway.
Very true.
Now, the one caution I will give here, because I see this a lot with my students, is mom and dad will always say, well, in case they don't get into med school, I want them to have something employable like an engineering degree. Okay. And I understand that. The problem is, and why I generally discourage engineering as an undergraduate major with my kids, is almost every undergraduate engineering program grades harder than any other major. So you might have a 3.2, 3.3 and be near the top of your class as a biomedical engineer. Med schools do not care what your major is. They care what your GPA is. And they know that biomed may have a harder GPA requirement. They don't care. If you don't have the kind of GPA they're looking for, you're pretty much out of luck, even if you did relatively well to everybody else in your engineering degree. So if you want to major in engineering and thinking you're going to go into medicine, you need to understand you're going to work a lot harder than the students that are in chemistry and biology or history or English or whatever, because truly med schools don't care what the major is.
So, and I know the MCAT has changed. The emphasis has changed in terms of what questions are asked, and they're trying to encourage students to not just go in who are pre-med majors and major in biology, that they're encouraging the psychology and the history. So if they don't major in these subjects, my understanding is that they still have to have the science prerequisites. Is that still the case?
Yes. Med schools have specific classes that they want to see. And generally, it's a year of physics, a year of biology, a year of general chemistry, a year of organic chemistry, now typically a year of psychology. Some want, or a year of calculus. Some want a year of English. Some want a year of biochem. But again, there's some variations, but generally the core classes are really what the med schools want to see. And whether it's from a history major or English major, it truly does not matter. So, yeah, major in whatever you like, as long as you understand you've got these classes you have to take. And med schools will be fine.
So you mentioned a book. Tell us what the name of your book is, and if my students are interested, where can they find your book?
It's available on Amazon. It's called BSMD Programs, The Complete Guide. Make sure, because I just had this conversation with a counselor yesterday who had bought the book and paid extra for it thinking it must be a special edition. We update the edition every year, so make sure you're getting the current year's edition. What happens is there are some resellers on Amazon that will buy up a bunch of the old books and then bump the prices up and sell an old book for a higher price than what the new book is running. So, yeah, just be careful on that.
And if someone needs to reach you, Todd, how do they do that if they have a question?
Either give me a call. I mean, I talk with a lot of counselors. I get a lot of referrals from counselors. But I'm also happy to talk to people just kind of in general thoughts on BSMD or if they get general questions. My phone number is 320-262-9955. My email is todd@collegeadmissions with an S, partners with an S.com.
Perfect. And I'll post that on the website so that my class can see it as well. So thank you for your time today. This has been very informative, and I always enjoy speaking with you and learn much as and this is an ever-evolving field. I mean, things don't stay the same at all, do they?
It is moving, and what colleges are good and what colleges are not. There's some variation of that, who's got programs and not. Yeah, so, but it's fun. I love working with these kids. So,
well, and it shows. It shows. So, thank you very much. This concludes our interview for today.
All right, Cindy. Thanks.
You bet. Thanks. Bye-bye.